All right. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for joining. We're going to go through some resume building strategy today as part of our first workshop with the Tech Under 20 group. And I want to thank, I guess, the Tech Under 20 coordinators. So Ananya, Rory, I think are the main ones I've been talking to. So again, thanks for this opportunity, and I hope we can provide some good content to you guys here today. So this is a very brief agenda. We're going to go through some of the detailed information here about each of these different things. So I won't really talk too much about it right now. I'll kind of just jump in and we'll go from there. So first question I like to ask just generally is, okay, why should I do this, right? Or why should I be building a strong resume in the first place? And maybe some of you have asked that question, maybe some of you haven't. But what I'm going to ask. So this will be kind of part of our process as we go through. So I'm going to ask a few questions throughout the workshop, and I hope you guys will participate and throw your answers into the chat. So starting with this as our first question, why should we build a strong resume? And I think that's just a general question that if you haven't thought about it yet, maybe it's worth thinking about. So what do you guys think? Feel free to throw it into the chat and I'll kind of read it out for everybody else. Yep. To provide a background for employers. Yep, absolutely. Telling employers what you're capable of. Definitely. Highlighting skills. Standing out from other candidates. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, you guys are all along the right track there. So my answer in general, sure, is probably simplified here, but I think you guys have captured it, is essentially step one, we're trying to land a job, right? The second 2 points that I have there are just strategies or kind of conceptual, philosophical mindsets that I like to build along with the resume, which is why I've included them here, because it's something that you guys can start thinking about, especially as you're heading in either your way through high school or into university. But essentially, you're building a product, right? And that product actually is you. And so what are you going to do with that product? Well, you have to be able to display it or market yourself. So essentially the resume is your first piece of marketing material. And in terms of product design, basically what you want to think about is what are the features that you as the product want to have? Or what is it that you think you want to be promoting or providing value from, or being able to explain to employers of your capability? And thinking about it from a product design perspective is an interesting way of doing it, because if you understand how to build a resume, or if you understand how to build products, which we're going to do a workshop on that in a few weeks, if you can understand those concepts, it's going to tie directly into building your resume, because it's essentially building the same thing. So just something that I like to share with people, because I think obviously the first point here about trying to land a job is the most obvious one. But there are all these additional benefits of building a strong resume that will help you through other parts of your careers. So building a resume is not just purely for the sake of getting a job. It can also teach you a number of skills, which you'll be able to use and continue to build on in the future. So same as with most things, I do like to start with the vision. And that's going to be different for every person, and it's a personal choice, or it's a personal thought process that you may or may not have gone through yet. But these are the kinds of questions that you should try to answer or be looking to answer at some point in time. It may not be right away, but these are the kinds of ideas or questions that you want to start asking yourself to help you build this vision. Because at the end of the day, if you have a big picture vision of where you want to go, the steps along the way can become a little bit easier. So if you have a dream job, that might be a good place to start. What do you see yourself doing? And also in terms of that, what is the time frame? So is this 5 years out, 10 years out? If you're just entering high school, maybe you haven't thought about this at all, or maybe you have thought about it. That's either way is okay. But it's a question that at some point in time, you probably want to think about, right? And then once you have that in mind, then you can think about, okay, well, what are your short-term goals? Where should this career path start, right? And then even before that, or maybe as you're approaching that, what are the steps you should target or take along the way? Because it's sometimes hard to figure out how to get to that huge dream goal or dream job without having these little baby steps in between, right? And then based on that, you can think about what path you should take, because I think now, especially the way the world has been evolving, there are many different pathways, and there's a lot of less traditional pathways that you can take to get to a certain goal or end vision. So that's something you can think about as well. So just some points here about strategy concepts, and these are all related to the resume. But again, if we think about resumes as products, or you as a product, these are, again, just questions that you want to think about, or things that are going to help you, not just with a resume, but it's also going to tie in with the interview strategy, which we're going to talk about in the next session, product design, like we already said, and all these different things. So like I said, vision is a good first thing to think about. Another key fundamental is differentiation. Obviously, you guys are aware that you're going to be competing out there in the market against a whole bunch of other students or other people maybe that have already graduated or already have experience, and you're going to be competing with them. And the thing you have to figure out is, okay, well, how are you going to stand out from that competition, right? How are you going to differentiate yourself? And that's definitely something you want to be thinking about when you're building a resume as well. Right. Employer psychology is a big one. We're not going to talk about it too detailed today because we're going to do kind of a high level viewpoint on it. But if you guys have questions about that later, I'd be more than happy to discuss that, because I think it's an interesting topic. And I think based on where a number of you are in your schooling or education level, you may not have insight into this kind of stuff. And because I've been in the industry for a long time, and I've talked to a lot of different employers and hiring managers and stuff like that, the actual psychology or the mindset that employers have is definitely different than employees students heading into the employee kind of realm. So it's definitely something you want to think about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that to get some details on it. The next one here is page real estate. So again, this is just in terms of psychologically, we want to look at a page. The top of the page is probably going to be more valuable than the bottom of the page. Maybe the side or left side margin as opposed to right side margin, all these different things. And especially when we start looking at the different sections that are build a resume, the actual location of those can be important. So definitely something to think about. Keywords, obviously, I'm sure you guys are aware that there are certain buzzwords or key terminology points that you want to add to your resume. That's a good thing to do. If anybody is telling you that you shouldn't necessarily do that, you might want to question why. But definitely buzzwords or salesy kind of words or acronyms, those are generally good things to include on your resume. And the last point here is just iteration. Just obviously, nothing is going to be perfect right off the bat. Your resume itself usually goes through multiple iterations. It's going to take a long time to get to the resume that you might be happy with. And as you're building more experiences, you're going to be adding things to it or removing things as you go. So that's just another part of the process that we want to be aware of to optimize a resume as time moves on. So we're going to go through the basic structure of a resume right now, but I would like to break it down basically into two key parts, layout and content. And the reason I'm putting and content is because we're going to get to some topics here about actual advice or how to analyze or critique your resume. And the challenge that I see from a lot of people that are giving advice is that they tend to look at each one of these sometimes in isolation. So when we're looking at the layout, people might suggest, oh, you should put this into this place and this in this other place. And I think you have to think about not just the layout of it, but the content in relation to the layout. So we're going to go through a few points here, and you guys can just think about those a little bit more as we go on. So basic layout guidelines. These are the main sections that you want to think about. I'm sure you guys are aware of this. And if you're not, we'll run through them very quickly. But obviously, contact information is key. A skill summary is definitely something that I think is useful. A lot of resumes that I've looked at and that I talk to people in the industry about will suggest, yeah, you want to summarize those skills. Arguably, your entire resume is a summary of all your experiences, but we also want to drill that down even more. And we'll talk a little bit about why we want to do that in a few minutes. Experiences obviously are important. Volunteer experience, work experience, even research projects or project experience, all those different things can be added to your resume and should be added to show your capability, right? Personal interests is one that I do get some questions about from time to time because I think people are not sure whether they should be adding those things. Personally, I think that's a valuable asset, and especially when we're talking about differentiation. Um, Sometimes you can have somebody that's in your class that has comparable marks, and you guys have done the same courses, same programs, all or arguably the same kind of thing. And if we can compare the differences between you, okay, maybe your experiences have to be part of it, but also personal interests. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And in actuality, I think it's actually a great thing. Whether you play a different sport or you're part of a team or you've gone to a certain club, all those different things are just adding to the vision or to the whole product package of who you are. And if you can use that in a certain way, so for example, I definitely look at resumes when people say they've played team sports. And obviously, when you join a company, you're going to be part of a team. So those are just simple indications that I can get from your extracurriculars or your personal interests that can show me what you might be capable of and how I can relate that to what I'm going to leverage from you in an employment scenario, right? And I guess the last point here, obviously, is education, which you guys all understand. I did keep it at the bottom for a reason, but we'll kind of get into that in a second here. So these are some typical pieces of advice. I'm not going to read through them all, but you guys can kind of go through them really quickly. Basically, there are suggestions in here that I like to give, and then there are suggestions that other people I've heard do not give. So the ones I've highlighted here in red are ones that I have heard from students that they do not necessarily hear from other people. So we're going to get to a whole topic here about advice and how to read it and how to take advice from different people. The reason I'm showing you that these 3 points in the middle there are not being given necessarily by everybody, maybe it's a smaller, or maybe it's a medium level percentage of people that provide those kinds of advice. The reason I'm just sharing that is just from my own anecdotal experience that I can share with you of people that I've talked to that ask me questions about those areas, right? So they're asking, should I include personal interests or extracurriculars? Should I have education at the top? And should I be able to split my experiences into different sections? Now, my answer to all of those is yes. And also it depends, but yes, for sure. And if it makes sense for your content. So again, we have to tie the layout advice to your actual content, right? If it, for some reason, your education is very valuable. So let's say, for example, and I mean, this could be arguable, but I think we could probably all agree that if you went to Harvard or MIT or one of these kinds of places, maybe putting your education at the top is an important thing. But if your school, let's say, isn't necessarily the top school in that field, maybe it's not as much of a selling feature as it could be, but maybe some of your other experiences are a better selling feature. So we do want to think about that kind of stuff, and that should help to drive or determine where you want to place certain sections on your resume. So content advice, I mean, these ones are probably pretty straightforward. I think some of you should have heard of these ones. Again, I'm just going to highlight the ones that are personally ones that I provide as advice, but not always that I've heard from other people. That doesn't mean that they don't think those points as well, but maybe those are just not the key ones that they are focusing on. But these are, again, just points of advice that I would provide to somebody, and these are just general points, so you can take them as you will. Again, we need to be able to tie this to the layout and the actual specific content that you have as well. So we're going to do a little bit of an analysis here, and you guys can help me out with this on the chat. So look for some participation here. This is a resume of a former student of mine that he allowed me to post this one up for you guys. I've taken out all the important details there, but this is just an example. So what we're going to do here is we're going to break it down, right? So as we were talking about from a structural perspective, it hits the mark on all the different pieces, right? So we had obviously contact information at the top, education is there, experiences are there, the skill summary is on the left-hand side, and personal interests are included there as well. So um, yeah, I don't think there's too much to discuss specifically there. Does anybody have any questions about this one? If you do, feel free to jump on your mic. Otherwise, we can just kind of continue on with the analysis. Okay, so I am going to look for some audience participation here, and you guys can just type it into the chat if you'd like. If we were to analyze, so we're going to do a little bit of a team critique here. So if you were to analyze this resume, and hopefully you guys can see that. If not, I mean, we can try and blow it up a little bit, but just based on the pieces of advice that I have there, which ones do you think, if any, would I be able to still provide to this person on their resume? Feel free to just type that into the chat there if you think you would give any one of these bullet points to this person. If you think none, then just type none and you can, okay. Yeah, so avoid sentences, I guess, is the main one you guys are thinking of. Anything else, or anybody else notice anything that they would, that maybe is not even on this list that they would suggest? Yeah, the links are there. Sorry, I took them out at the top here. There are these the white marks, so the links are there. But that's a good catch that you guys are looking for that. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think you guys are on the right track here. The two main points that I would make is in terms of the personal interests and extracurriculars, and I mean, they did include that in kind of the about me section here. But I would also argue that I think they're, and especially because I know the person, I know that they have other interests and other extracurriculars that they participate in. Personally, I would suggest that they could add those in because it adds another layer of capability or I guess interest from the employer's perspective to say, okay, it looks like from their resume, if we're looking at the content, that they have quite a few experiences. So obviously this is, and I mean, like it says at the top there, 4th year mechanical. So they've had quite a few experiences in terms of actual engineering or co-ops. And their skills look like it's there. They have some other experiences and volunteer stuff. But for example, I know this person plays sports, right? So that's just another layer that they could add to their resume that maybe if they're competing against some other more competitive students that also have a lot of great experience, this is just another differentiating factor for them. And the other piece that I was going to mention is just in terms of education. So one of the points that I had made before was about not having or not necessarily needing to have the education at the top. And again, the reasoning for that is because we want to try and take advantage of the real estate of our page as much as possible. And if we do think that the education piece is valuable, then sure, you can make that argument. But I would probably argue in this case, because they have a lot of good experience in as co-ops, that they probably don't need to flaunt the education piece at the top for this specific resume. I think the skills summary piece could be moved up a little bit higher because I would argue that it provides a little bit more of a readability factor to the resume, which again is just something that we haven't really got to talk about just yet, but is definitely something to think about from an employer psychology perspective. How do people read resumes? They usually read from top to bottom, and how quickly are they reading it? Usually pretty quick. So they are going to try and skim through. And sure, their eyes are probably going to jump to that skills section anyway, but the easier of a time you can do to make them or allow them to be able to find that with their eyes, the easier it's going to be, or the better chance you have to be able to get to that next level, right? Which is obviously the short list or getting to the interview. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few kind of traps, as I like to call them. So the remainder of the session here today is going to be going through things that I think you may not have heard before, because I'm sure if you guys have Googled how to make a resume or you watch YouTube videos, I'm sure you're going to see content like that that's already out there, and I'm probably not going to do too much of a better job than they are. So I would encourage you to go check out some stuff like that. Maybe I can post some links for that later on. But the following points are things that I don't see too often and I don't hear too often, but I think are definitely important. And I'd like you guys to think about those as you're building your resumes. So we're going to go through these quote unquote traps just so that you can think about them, try to understand them, and then hopefully avoid them yourself. So first one here is the advice phenomenon, and these are just kind of terms that I'm kind of coining. But at the end of the day, if you haven't done this yet, you're probably going to in the future. And if you have experienced this already, you probably know what I'm talking about. But basically, you're going to be able to get a lot of advice from a lot of different people. Could be your teachers, could be your parents, could be upper year students, could be employers or employees or colleagues. There's going to be everybody out there that wants to give you advice. And the interesting part is that as soon as somebody has gotten a job, they automatically assume that they are now an expert in looking at resumes. Now, is that true? I'm not going to be able to judge that. And I mean, you might have a difficult time judging that as well. But at the end of the day, you're going to be getting a ton of advice from a lot of different people. And is that good or bad? Well, this is where we're going to jump into the kind of solution to this, and we're going to find out. But at the end of the day, you're going to be getting a bunch of conflicting advice because it's only going to be a matter of time before somebody tells you, yes, you should put education at the top. And then you listen to me and I say, no, you don't need to put it at the top. So the question is, who should you trust and what should you do? Right? So here's 3 points that I think you guys can think about, and hopefully these will help you to critically analyze that advice that you're getting. Because like we said, it's going to be difficult to understand who you can trust, and you're going to see both sides. So first point here is analyze it critically, right? And accept that advice, but make sure you're analyzing it. So the context matters. And the reason I say that is because why is what they're saying not going to make sense? And you have to kind of ask the inverse. So we're going to kind of mention that a couple times here. But it's also kind of ties into number 2 is, okay, why should I not trust your advice? Right? So most people are good at explaining what they think and why they think that, but you kind of want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence and asking about the inverse, right? So I should be able to explain to you why I think you should do this and also why I think you shouldn't do it, right? Because if I'm not being objective about the possibilities of what the different scenarios are where one piece of advice works and one piece of advice doesn't, maybe I just am providing you with general advice, which when we look at each individual case, general advice doesn't always apply, right? So you have to be able to consider that your specific scenario, maybe a general advice is a good place to start, but eventually you're going to have to critique that and cater it specifically to your situation. So for example, I probably shouldn't be giving a high school student at grade 9 level the same advice as a 3rd or 4th year student in university. And yet, even if we look back like 5 minutes ago, I just gave you a bunch of general advice points, right? So the thing you should be asking, and you should be asking me just as much as you ask anybody else, is why should I not trust your advice? And if I can't give you a good answer to that, then maybe that's your first indication that you shouldn't trust my advice, right? So that's the first 2 points there. The last point there is that it's very difficult to be able to figure out what is the right way or the wrong way. And I don't even like using those terms most of the time. I'd rather use optimal, suboptimal, but arguably it's the same thing. And at the end of the day, you're not really going to be able to know what works or what doesn't work until you test it out. So you have to try things out, and that's not a problem. I mean, I've sent out like 10 different versions of my same resume, trying to get some feedback on it. But that's the most critical part, is that through that iteration process, you have to try and get or collect feedback, which nowadays is very difficult. I mean, arguably it was difficult before too, but it's definitely difficult now because all the things you're applying to are probably going to be online. And to even get an employer to respond to you or to get an HR person to respond to you is going to be difficult. But it's up to you to try and do that, because if you can't figure out what's wrong with your current resume, how are you going to know what to fix, right? And that kind of is going to tie in here with my second point here. Correlation versus causation. So I'm going to take a second to kind of explain this concept, because this is a huge concern of mine in terms of the world of data and all the information that we're getting passed to. Basically, I'm going to start with the definitions here, but correlation is like a connection or a relationship between two or more things, as opposed to a causation, which is something is happening and it is causing something else to happen in return, right? So it's cause and effect in a relationship. The difference between those first two is that a causation is a correlation because there is a connection and relationship there, but a correlation isn't necessarily a causation, right? You can see two things that are connected, but it's not necessarily indicating that they are causing one another to occur, right? Now, why do we need to talk about this in terms of our resume? Well, again, when we're thinking about it from an advice perspective, you're going to look at a number of people that have gotten jobs before or that have worked at a certain place, and they're going to tell you, well, you should trust me because I've done this and I got a job. And you're going to say, okay, sure, you got a job, that's great, so you must have good advice. Now, I think that's a problem, right? And I think what we want to make sure is that we are correlating how they got the job or what the advice has to do with their explanation of why you should trust them, right? I'm going to be giving you a number of pieces of advice here, even today, based on my own personal experience of working as a manager, working as an employer, starting my own company, all those different things. But does that mean that I have the perfect advice to tell you just because I've been an employer or I've hired people? I can't speak for the entire industry, right? I can't speak for all the companies that are out there or all the different hiring managers. Everyone's going to have their own different perspective, and it's up to you to try and find out what that information is so that you can actually analyze that data and then use it effectively for your own good, right? The second point that I'm making here is this concept of it makes sense. And that's a common phrase that I hear from most students when I give them advice. And I can't say I blame you for saying that because it happens to me all the time as well. But it generally happens when I'm learning something new, right? And when you're learning something new, most things when they're explained to you are going to quote unquote make sense, right? But that's also just a factor of the fact that we don't necessarily know the right questions to ask to debunk or to make it not make sense. So just being aware of the concept that, sure, it's probably going to make sense to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good advice that you should listen to, right? So kind of went through these already, so I'm just going to skip through them pretty quickly. But basically, some questions that you guys can ask to help you to beat through this correlation causation issue is, what is the real problem that you're trying to solve? Now, I think a number of you that have been applying to jobs may have looked at your resume and then looked at it again after you applied and said, you know what, I didn't get any responses, so maybe I should look at my resume and fix it up. Now, that's pretty common and it happens all the time. And a lot of people that I've talked to are constantly changing or fixing their resume. But the real question is, are we sure that that's what the problem is? And if we don't ask that question, then it's going to be difficult for us to understand whether that's the actual problem we're trying to solve, or maybe it's something else, right? Maybe it's not the format of your resume, maybe it's the content, or maybe it's not how it looks, maybe it's the actual experience that you've had, maybe you're not having the right experiences, right? So some of those are not resume fixable problems. Some of those are, you need to go out and actually get this experience, or you need to go out and take another course or learn some new material, right? That's point one. Point two is, how strong is the data that you have? We kind of just talked about that in terms of can we correlate all these different data points from feedback, or is it just based on the fact that, hey, we've gotten rejected like 50 times and we think something needs to change? And maybe that's true, but maybe it's also not true. So we have to be careful about putting effort into things that maybe we don't need to put effort into, right? And the last point here is just about data. And I mean, this is just a statistical kind of concept. So we do want to try and get as many data points as possible, which is why my piece of advice earlier was to accept as much advice as you can, because the more data points you collect, the more you'll be able to correlate that data and hopefully get to some kind of causation rule or some kind of explanation of what you need to do next. The more data you have, the better. Obviously, there's a limit, but realistically, you're probably not going to reach that limit. And I think the question there is, would you rather trust 10 data points to prove something or 10,000? And I'm hoping the answer that you guys are going to give is 10,000, because 10 data points is kind of in the level of n equals 1, which is not a great strategy. I mean, if I told you that the vaccine was tested on only 10 people and it was all successful, you'd probably be a little bit concerned, right? As opposed to 10,000 people. And the last point that I'm just going to make here about some of the traps that you might fall into are the should you or shouldn't you paradox, is what I'm calling it. Which is basically somebody is going to tell you that you should do something, and then somebody else is going to tell you that you shouldn't do something, and you're going to have to answer that question for yourself. Now, the challenge or the trap that I find that people fall into are related to the problems A and B earlier, which are basically that you're able to make a single data point or a weak argument stating that you should follow through with something, and you don't have too much data to prove why you should or shouldn't do something. And that's kind of common between both. And basically the solution is to collect more data and analyze it. And let's say you can't do that. What should you do then? Well, I think my suggestion to you would be to focus on the fundamentals, right? So there are certain things that you can do that are fundamentally going to work because they've worked over time. And as soon as you start getting into the nuance or the complexity of things, it actually can work against you. So that's something just to keep in mind, is that if you try to get too complicated or you try and cater something too specifically, if it's not done correctly, that can be worse than just focusing on something simple, right? And the last point there is just about proving and disproving your thesis. So again, this is just about trying to find the opposing opinion. So if I told you you should put education at the top and somebody else told you that you shouldn't, you should make sure you try and understand why. And like we said, hopefully, I mean, or at least at the beginning, both might make sense, but you want to try and figure out which one you should do in the context of your own personal situation. Okay, so we're going to jump back into some audience participation here, and we're just going to go through a few examples, and then we'll wrap it up here with a Q&A at the end. So we're going to take a look at a few resumes that I've just found online, just with a quick Google search. They're pretty much just templates. But what I want you guys to do to get yourself in the practice of learning how to look at a resume is to try and critique this, same as how we did before, and tell me which of these pieces of advice would you give to this person to improve their resume. So feel free to type into the chat right now, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So, I mean, there's a few answers there. One page only, so I think I would agree with that one. It's one, or I should have agreed with that one. I guess I didn't. Yeah, I'll edit that one. But yeah, definitely number of bullet points was one. Paragraphs, kind of sentences was one that I had put in. Prioritizing real estate, again, was just something that I had thrown in because I think that they probably could be moving this stuff around a little bit to optimize it. There's some work experience that's at the bottom there, which arguably might be more valuable than their education. So I think they could be moving that around. But they do have a little bit of a summary at the top, so that's a good thing. Bolding is like you guys were mentioning. So the one point I will like to discuss, so for those of you that mentioned optimizing white space, can you come on to your mic if that's possible and explain your thought process there? Because I think I'd like to just talk that one out with you guys just to make sure we're all understanding or on the same page for it. So I think it was.
Yeah, so hello. I said that they should optimize the white and blank space because I thought compared to the first resume that we sort of saw with the fourth year mechanical student.
Hmm.
They didn't really have this white border around. And also, I feel like they could maybe put in more points if they were to optimize that space that they're sort of, not utilizing right now, or I don't know if, they should utilize it. Yes, I guess in the case.
Right. Okay. So I understand what you're saying. I think the point that I would be making about optimizing the white space is
Mhm.
not necessarily overcrowding the space with too much content.
Right.
So I think they've actually done a reasonable job of putting in points. And I guess the thing I should explain about the optimization of white or blank space is that we want to make it easy. And this is the kind of stuff I was talking about earlier about employer psychology is we want to make it easy for the reader, aka the employer, to absorb the content that we're providing. So
Right.
one thing that I would say about the other resume is it's quite packed with a lot of content. Now,
Mm-hmm.
in that case, it's not necessarily a bad thing because they actually have some pretty solid experiences, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
do tend to see sometimes from more junior students that are building their resumes that they'll try and throw in a lot of different points and cover up all the white space. But in my mind, that's not necessarily optimizing it. That might actually be taking away from it because you're kind of diluting your own value of experiences by trying to add extra things that aren't necessarily going to look that great in an employer's mind.
Right. For sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
So, and this is where kind of I was mentioning in the piece of advice from before is like you can very easily, it's a paradox a lot of the times, right? It's like,
Mhm.
okay, should I have a lot of white space or should I fill it up with content? And we just now have seen two examples where either one can work, right? So you have to kind of
Definitely.
take a look at each scenario specifically, which is why like building a resume itself is not trivial, right? It's
Mhm.
challenging to be able to figure that out. But I think the most important part is just as long as you have a reasoning or at least an explanation for why,
Mhm.
um, that's something then that you can go and get some feedback on and try and talk to somebody and see whether they agree with your analysis or not. And maybe you're right. Maybe they do need to add some points here, but I think we'd have to actually dig into the content of it and look at the job specifically that they're applying for to see whether we need to add or subtract points.
For sure. Yeah, I agree with that. Thanks for that.
Cool. Yeah. Um, so there is a point here about, okay, what does prioritized real estate mean? So that's basically taking advantage of the locations on your resume that are more valuable. So the top arguably is more valuable than the bottom because what does somebody see when they see your resume for the first time? They're going to see the top of the page, right? And this is just kind of employer psychology, but also just somebody who's reading a resume psychology. And that's also why they suggest to provide one page only. And let's say you did have enough content for 2 pages, which is completely fine. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but especially as a junior person, I would think about whether you need to put 2 pages there. It can definitely be possible, like I said, but it's probably less likely because I've seen a lot of, like we just looked at the previous resume, there's a lot of content in there and they were able to make 1 page with it, right? So if you have less content than that, why do you need 2 pages? I guess is the question that employers might be asking, right? Um, but again, so let's assume that you did have 2 pages. The first page is going to be more valuable in terms of real estate than the second page, right? Because if they don't get past the first page, they're never going to see your second page. And same with the top of the page versus the bottom. If they don't get past the skill summary or your, let's say, whatever program you're in, if you happen to put education near the top, if they don't get past that, it doesn't really matter anymore what you've put at the bottom of the page. So prioritizing that real estate is important because you want them to continue reading. And if they don't get past the first few things they see, again, like we said, it's not going to help you, right? So does that make sense? I guess, Pavni, you're asking about that?
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, no problem. Okay. All right, let's try another example here. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry. Um, okay, so what do you guys think about this one? Yeah, sorry. I I bolded out, or I guess marked out all the projects and portfolio stuff. I think they did have it in there, but yeah, we'll just assume that that one is pretty much in there. But yeah, it seems like you guys are on the right track. So the only other things I think that I would add there, so they do have a second page. Again, though, arguably, this person seems like they're more senior, right? So having a second page in their perspective isn't necessarily a bad thing, but looking at how they've structured their resume right now, the fact that they have paragraphs and sentences, that could be trimmed down, right? The qualifications profile itself is quite large. I mean, if you look at it, it's taking up basically the top half of the page, which if we're talking about like a skill summary, I think those bullet points do a good job of it. But again, even that could probably be drilled down into maybe 4 columns as opposed to 3. And now maybe you could cut that entire section in half at least. Arguably, you could do a little bit more than that, right? So it really just depends on what you're trying to do. Maybe this person is applying to somebody that wants to see this kind of context, but again, maybe because they're more senior, that's more applicable to them. You guys as more junior, I would argue that you probably don't need to write out, or you don't want to be writing full sentences, especially in like summary sections. Bullet points are generally a good strategy, and you do want to be able to make sure that you're being concise and getting straight to the point of whatever sentences or bullet points that you are providing there. And keywords and bolding obviously are other strategies that they can use. Looking at this right now, this is very difficult to read, in my opinion, because it's a block of text, right? And again, just kind of talking out a little bit more this employer psychology thing that we were discussing earlier. When you think about somebody who has to read resumes, you have to try and think about it from their perspective in terms of what is this process like, right? So, I mean, speaking for myself and obviously from other people I've talked to, you're going to be going through, if you're trying to hire somebody, you're going to be going through, let's say 50 to 100 resumes. And the first question is, okay, well, how long are you going to be spending on each resume? And the answer is probably like 30 seconds or less, right? At least as a first scan. So if I'm spending 30 seconds on this, I can't even necessarily read through that first paragraph and absorb it properly in 30 seconds, right? If I'm really trying to absorb it. So if I only have 30 seconds per resume, this resume, even just the first page, is probably costing me a few minutes. And unless I see something that's going to jump off the page to me, I might be skipping past this person right away, which is unfortunate because as we're seeing that like they're senior or more senior in terms of their experience, and it seems like they have some quality there. So, but unfortunately, if there's a number of other people and I have to look through 50 resumes that also have similar content, I'm probably going to skip past this person. So just some psychology or things to think about is that you want to try and make it very readable and easy to absorb in terms of what you're providing to people on your resume. And I would argue that you could make this entire section or a number of sections much more concise, still be able to provide the same content or takeaways for the employer when they're reading that section, but have it in a much smaller, real estate profile. All right. One more try here. So this one is a high school resume. So what do you guys think about this one? And again, in the contact information, all the projects and portfolios were there. I just took them out. Yep. Bolding important terms, highlighting skills. Yep, for sure. So the only other two that I would have added there probably are leveraging industry keywords, though again, they're probably in fairly junior levels, so it's probably not that critical. Career objective is fairly long. Yep, I would agree. And I think they're somewhat still writing it in sentence form. So the way that you can tell that is just by reading through a resume and looking at the small words that they use, right? If you can find a way to trim a sentence by removing some of the smaller words that arguably don't really add too much value, you can still understand the sentence without them. That's an indication that your sentence might be too long. Okay, so last one here. And you guys can tell me what you think about this one. Yep, definitely. I would lower the education as well. Skill section more highlighted. Yep, absolutely. Yep. And the only other one that I would put in there is just the number of bullet points, because I think there's, especially in the, even in the skill section, I think, especially if you're saying basic knowledge of, you could probably combine a number of those together, right? Again, if you were to cram all this content, or not cram, even if you were to optimize the content in here and this was all that you had, you would be able to make it arguably more readable or more presentable by either making additional columns like we've seen on the other ones for the skill section, or making the sentences shorter or easier to read. But again, I think this one does a fairly decent job, especially because they're at the high school level, that there's not that much content. But again, what kind of job are they applying to, and what is their best selling feature? Those are the things that we want to be thinking about. So again, that's probably why we want to move education a little bit further down. Okay, so I'm going to give you one final hack here, and this kind of leads into our last, or I guess our next workshop. But the question that we were trying to answer at the beginning was, why should we even bother to build a strong resume in the first place? And the point was, well, if we get to have a strong resume, that can probably help us to land a job. Now, if landing a job is the goal, maybe a strong resume isn't necessarily the answer. And I'm going to quiz you guys here right now. What do you think could be the answer? So let's say you didn't want to have a strong resume to land a job. How could you land a job instead? Bingo. Brandon's got it. Networking. Yeah. I think you guys all on the right track here. So that was not too hard of a question there. But yes, exactly. And that's basically going to be our next session, is going to be on professional networking. So hopefully you guys will come back for that one. But we'll definitely be talking about some more practical ways to network and understanding the concepts of it, and especially the why, because again, that's important for everybody, just to understand, like, why are we doing this? And it's the same question here. Why should I build a strong resume? And maybe the answer is you don't have to. Right? If you are good at networking, or you have a huge network to leverage, maybe you don't need to worry about your resume. And I think that's something that you want to try and think about, especially in this world that we live in, where there's so many alternatives and other ways to do things. Maybe you don't need to worry about your resume at all if you have a network, right? So now the debate is, well, is networking more valuable or harder than building a resume? Again, we can probably debate that next time. But again, just something to think about for whether it makes sense to build your resume or to focus a lot of time on it. And I'll come back to that one on the next session. So, all right. Any questions or thoughts that you guys have about this, or any just general things you want to ask? We will be hosting a resume review session on Wednesday of this week. So that you guys can bring your resumes to that session, and we will go through them. I will go through some specific advice for you on your individual resume based on your own scenario. So what I will request from each of you is that when you're coming to that, just be prepared to answer some simple questions of, like, what kind of jobs are you applying to? What is the current level or program that you're in? And what are you trying to do with that resume? Because that's going to help us to answer specifically how we can change or update or critique your resume. Because if you're applying to a project manager job as opposed to a software job, you might be trying to do different things in a different way. So that will be on Wednesday, and Ananya has added the Airtable link again for those of you who want to sign up for the next session, which will be on networking. But yeah, so that's all I have for right now. Do you guys have any questions? If you do, feel free to jump on the mic and we can talk through it. Or if you want me to go back to a couple of previous slides to explain something again, I'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, you guys are free to go. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, no problem, guys. Hopefully that was useful for you. And we will see you at the next one then.